The monolith had stood on Ethon Prime for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no living creature had ever touched it and survived with their mind intact. The temple that housed it was massive, built from white stone that seemed to glow under the pale blue sun, and every day thousands of pilgrims from across the galaxy came to stare at the artifact that had defeated their greatest scientists, their most powerful psychics, and their most ancient civilizations. Ambassador Alara Vance knew none of this history when she first arrived on the planet, because humanity was still new to the galactic stage, and nobody had bothered to teach them anything important. She stepped off the transport ship and into the crowded spaceport, her eyes wide as she took in the chaos of alien life around her. There were tall beings with silver skin and 4 arms, short creatures covered in blue fur, and floating entities that seemed to be made of pure light. A Velanthi official was waiting for her, his pale face expressionless, and his large black eyes watching her with something that might have been contempt or might have been boredom. "You are the human ambassador," he said, and it was not a question. "I am," Alara replied, trying to stand taller even though she barely reached his chest. "Ambassador Alara Vance, representing the United Earth government." The Velanthi made a sound that could have been a laugh or a cough, and then he turned and began walking without checking if she followed. Alara had been warned about this. Humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 60 years ago, and in galactic terms that made them infants, children who had just learned to crawl while the other species had been running for millennia. She followed the official through winding streets and past buildings that touched the clouds, and everywhere she looked she saw wonders that made her heart ache with the knowledge of how far her people still had to go. The temple appeared before them like a mountain made of light, and Alara stopped walking because she could not help herself. "What is that place?" she asked. The Velanthi paused and looked back at her with something new in his eyes, something that might have been surprise that she did not know. "That is the Temple of the Worthy," he said. "It houses the monolith of Ethon Prime, the most sacred artifact in the known galaxy, and you will attend the viewing ceremony tomorrow as part of your diplomatic duties." Alara wanted to ask more questions, but the official was already walking again, and she had to run to keep up. That night, in her small quarters at the human embassy, she searched through the limited database they had been given and tried to learn everything she could about this monolith. The information was sparse and often contradictory, but certain facts appeared again and again. The artifact was ancient beyond measure, older than any civilization currently alive, and it had been created by beings the galaxy called the Precursors, a race that had vanished millions of years ago and left behind only ruins and mysteries. Every species that had achieved space travel had tried to unlock the monolith's secrets, and every single one had failed. The Velanthi, with their powerful psychic abilities, had sent their greatest mind speakers to touch the artifact, and each one had been thrown back by an invisible force, their consciousness shattered by a single word that echoed through their skulls: unworthy. The Kreth, beings of living silicon who could process information faster than any computer, had analyzed the monolith for centuries and learned nothing. The Oravan, who had ruled the stars when humanity's ancestors were still climbing trees, had built this very temple around the artifact and declared themselves its guardians, yet even they could not make it respond. Alara read account after account of failure, of madness, of death, and she wondered why anyone would want to touch something so dangerous. But she also felt something else, something she could not name, a curiosity that burned in her chest like a small flame. The next morning she dressed in her formal uniform and joined the procession of diplomats heading to the temple, feeling small and out of place among the towering aliens and their flowing robes. The interior of the temple was even more impressive than the outside, with ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow and walls covered in writings from 100 different languages. And there, at the center of everything, stood the monolith. It was smaller than Alara had expected, only about twice her height, a simple column of black stone that seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. Yet something about it made her breath catch in her throat. The ceremony began, and priests from various species took turns approaching the artifact and offering prayers in languages Alara did not understand, and she stood at the back of the crowd and watched and tried to look respectful even though her mind was elsewhere. She kept staring at the monolith, and the longer she looked, the more she noticed something strange. There was a pattern on its surface, faint lines that seemed to shift and move when she tilted her head, visible only at certain angles, and she wondered if anyone else could see it. She glanced around at the other diplomats, but they were all focused on the priests, their eyes glazed with boredom or reverence, and none of them seemed to notice what she was seeing. The pattern grew clearer the longer she watched, and it almost looked like writing, like a message meant for someone who knew how to look. Without realizing what she was doing, Alara began to move forward, slipping between the larger bodies around her, drawn toward the artifact like a moth toward a flame. A voice in her head told her to stop, reminded her that she was nobody important, just a junior diplomat from a species that the galaxy barely acknowledged, but her feet kept moving. The Valanthi High Seer noticed her approach, and his eyes went wide with horror. "Human, stop!" he screamed, his voice cutting through the chanting of the priests. But it was too late. Alara's hand reached out and her fingers touched the cold black surface of the monolith, and in that moment, everything changed. The moment Alara's fingers met the surface of the monolith, she expected pain. She expected to be thrown across the room like all the others before her. She expected the word unworthy to tear through her mind and leave her broken on the temple floor. But none of that happened. Instead, the stone felt warm beneath her touch, almost alive, and light began to spread from where her hand rested, racing across the black surface like rivers of liquid gold. The chanting stopped, and for a long moment the only sound in the temple was the soft hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then the screaming began. Every alien in the room collapsed at the same moment, their bodies crumpling like puppets with their strings cut, and Alara spun around in horror, thinking she had somehow killed them all. But no, they were still breathing, still alive, just unconscious, overwhelmed by something that had passed through them like a wave through water. Something that had not touched Alara at all. She turned back to the monolith and found that she was no longer alone. A figure stood before her, made of light and shadow, humanoid in shape but not quite human, with features that shifted and changed each time she tried to focus on them. "You came," the figure said, and its voice was like music and thunder combined, beautiful and terrifying all at once. Alara's mouth was dry, but she forced herself to speak. "What are you?" "I am the Guardian," the figure replied. "I was left here by those who made this place, to wait for ones like you, and I have been waiting for a very long time." "Ones like me?" Alara asked, her voice shaking. "You mean humans?" The Guardian tilted its head, studying her with eyes that held no pupils, only swirling colors that made her dizzy if she looked too long. "I mean the inheritors," it said. "The ones who carry no gift, who hear no noise, who walk through the universe with minds untouched by the hands of my creators." Before Alara could ask what any of that meant, the temple doors burst open and soldiers poured in, weapons raised, their faces masks of fear and anger. The Valanthi High Seer was awake now, pushing himself up from the floor with trembling arms, and when he saw Alara standing unharmed before the glowing monolith, his expression twisted into something ugly. "Seize her," he commanded. "She has defiled the sacred artifact. She has attacked the representatives of the conquered." "I did not attack anyone," Alara protested, but strong hands were already grabbing her arms and pulling her away from the monolith. The Guardian watched all of this without moving, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. "We will speak again, inheritor," it said to Alara, and then it vanished, and the light in the monolith faded to a soft glow. What followed was chaos. Alara was taken to a holding cell deep beneath the temple, where she sat alone for what felt like days, wondering if her career was over, wondering if her life was over, wondering what she had done wrong by simply touching a piece of stone. Officials came and went, asking her the same questions over and over. How had she approached the monolith without being stopped? What had she done to make it respond? What weapon had she used to incapacitate the diplomats? What was her true mission on Ethon Prime? She answered truthfully every time, but they did not believe her, because the truth made no sense to them. A human, a member of a species that had barely learned to travel between stars, had done what their greatest minds could not, and there had to be a trick, there had to be deception, there had to be something more than simple touch. Scientists arrived from across the galaxy, bringing machines that hummed and beeped and scanned every inch of her body, and they found nothing unusual, nothing that could explain what had happened. She was human, ordinary, unremarkable in every way their instruments could measure. The Valanthi were furious, demanding that she be executed for her crime against their sacred site, but other voices argued for patience, for study, for understanding what had occurred before taking action. Meanwhile, the monolith had changed. Reports reached Alara through the guards who brought her food. Rumors passed from mouth to mouth throughout the station. The artifact was active now, glowing constantly, and the Guardian appeared each day to repeat the same message to whoever would listen. "Bring me the human," it said. "Only she can receive what I must give." The Galactic Concord held emergency meetings, and representatives shouted at each other in a dozen languages, and alliances that had stood for centuries began to crack under the weight of this impossible development. Some wanted to give Alara to the Guardian and see what secrets the monolith would reveal, while others wanted her killed before she could cause any more disruption to the established order. The human government on Earth sent frantic messages demanding the release of their ambassador, but their voices carried little weight in a galaxy that had never taken them seriously. 3 weeks after her imprisonment, Alara was finally brought back to the temple, her hands bound and her feet shackled, surrounded by guards who watched her like she was a bomb that might explode at any moment. The monolith still glowed, and as she approached, the Guardian appeared once more. "You have returned," it said, ignoring the aliens around them as if they did not exist. "I did not have much choice," Alara replied. The Guardian might have smiled. It was hard to tell with a face made of light. Choice is an illusion for most beings in this galaxy, but not for you, never for you, and that is precisely why you are here. "I do not understand any of this," Alara admitted. "I am nobody important, just a diplomat from a young species. Why would your creators leave this artifact for someone like me?" The Guardian was silent for a moment, and when it spoke again, its voice was softer, almost sad. "Because my creators made a terrible mistake long ago," it said. "They gave gifts to all the species they seeded across the stars, powers and abilities that would help them grow and thrive. But those gifts came with chains that none of them could see." "What kind of chains?" Alara asked. "Listen," the Guardian said, and suddenly Alara could hear it, a sound beneath all other sounds, a frequency that buzzed at the edge of perception, present in the voices of every alien around her, in the hum of their machines, in the very air they breathed. "They cannot hear it because they have always heard it," the Guardian explained. "It is part of them, woven into their minds from birth. But you, inheritor, you are deaf to the song of my creators, and that deafness is the greatest gift of all." "Why?" Alara whispered. The Guardian's form flickered, and images began to appear in the air around them. Images of darkness and hunger, and something vast moving between the stars. "Because something is coming," the Guardian said. "Something that follows the song, and when it arrives, only the deaf will survive." The images floating in the air showed horrors that Alara could barely comprehend, vast shapes moving through the darkness between galaxies, entities that seemed to be made of shadow and hunger, with no form and no mercy. "What are those things?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We called them the Silence," the Guardian replied, "because wherever they go, all other life falls quiet, consumed, and forgotten, and they have been hunting my creators across the universe for longer than your species has existed." The aliens in the temple were watching the images too, their faces pale with fear, and even the Velanthi High Seer had stopped glaring at Alara long enough to stare at the nightmare unfolding before them. "The precursors did not vanish," the Guardian continued. "They fled, running from galaxy to galaxy, trying to escape what they had brought upon themselves, and when they realized they could never outrun the Silence, they decided to leave behind a warning for those who came after." "But why could only I activate the monolith?" Alara asked. "Why not the Velanthi or the Kreth or any of the other species?" The Guardian turned to look at the assembled aliens, and something like pity crossed its shifting features. "Because they are marked," it said. "Every species my creators touched carries a piece of them inside their minds, a frequency that was meant to help them evolve and grow, but that same frequency is what the Silence follows." A Kreth scientist stepped forward, his silicon body clicking and whirring. "You are saying that the gifts the precursors gave us are actually a curse?" "Not a curse," the Guardian said. "A mistake. My creators did not know about the Silence when they seeded life across this galaxy. They did not understand that their psychic technologies left traces that could be tracked across the void. And by the time they learned the truth, it was too late." The High Seer pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his black eyes blazing. "And what of the humans? Why were they spared this mistake?" "They were not spared," the Guardian answered. "They were forgotten. Humanity evolved on a small planet at the edge of the galaxy, too far from the centers of precursor activity to be noticed. And so they grew alone, without gifts, without interference, without the song that marks all the others." Alara felt a strange mixture of emotions at these words. All her life she had been told that humanity was inferior, that they lacked the psychic powers of the Velanthi, or the processing abilities of the Kreth, or the ancient wisdom of the Oravan. And now, she was learning that this inferiority was actually their salvation. "The Silence cannot sense you," the Guardian said directly to her. "Your minds are quiet to them, invisible, and that is why my creators left this message for you to find." "What message?" Alara asked. The Guardian raised its hand, and the monolith began to glow brighter, and streams of data poured into Alara's mind. Star charts and schematics and warnings and instructions, more information than she could process in a lifetime. She fell to her knees, overwhelmed, and the Guardian knelt beside her. "I am sorry," it said. "Your mind is strong, but it was not made for this. I will give you what you can hold and store the rest for when you are ready." The flow of information slowed to a trickle, and Alara found herself understanding things she had never known before. The location of precursor weapons caches hidden across the galaxy, the weaknesses of the Silence, the truth about how the gifted species could be protected. "The Silence is already on its way," the Guardian said. "It sensed the beacon my creators left behind long ago, and it has been traveling toward this galaxy ever since, following the song, following the trail of minds that cry out without knowing they are being heard." "How long do we have?" Alara asked. "Months," the Guardian replied. "Perhaps a year, perhaps less. Time is difficult to measure when dealing with beings that exist partially outside of normal space." The temple erupted into chaos, diplomats shouting at each other, soldiers raising weapons they did not know how to use against such a threat, priests falling to their knees in prayer to gods that could not help them. But Alara remained calm, because she had seen something in the data the Guardian had given her, a possibility that the others could not imagine. "There is a way to stop them," she said. and her voice cut through the noise like a blade. Everyone turned to look at her, this small human who had caused so much disruption, and she stood up straight and faced them without fear. "The precursors built a device," she said, "a machine that can broadcast silence across the entire galaxy, that can deafen every mind to the frequency that the silence follows." "Then we must use it immediately," the High Seer exclaimed. "It is not that simple," Alara replied. "The device will not just protect you from the silence, it will strip away the gifts the precursors gave you, permanently." Silence fell over the temple, a different kind of silence, heavy with the weight of what she was saying. "The Valanthi would lose their psychic abilities," Alara continued. "The Kreth would lose their enhanced processing. The Oravon would lose their connection to the past. Every species touched by the precursors would become like us, like humans, ordinary and ungifted." "That is unacceptable," the High Seer roared. "We will find another way. We have time to develop weapons, to build defenses." "You have months," Alara reminded him, "and the silence has consumed civilizations far older and more powerful than yours." The Guardian watched this exchange without commenting, letting the galaxy's representatives argue among themselves, letting them come to terms with the impossible choice that lay before them. Alara understood their fear. She would not want to lose a part of herself either, even if that part was killing her slowly. But she also understood something else, something that her life as a human had taught her. Sometimes you had to let go of what you thought made you special in order to discover what truly made you strong. The conquered called for a recess, and diplomats scattered to contact their governments, to share the terrible news, to begin debates that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. And Alara sat alone in the temple, looking at the monolith that had changed everything, wondering if the galaxy would choose to survive or if pride would be the death of them all. The debates raged for 3 months, while the silence drew closer with every passing day. Alara watched from the sidelines as the galactic conquered tore itself apart, each species refusing to accept the sacrifice that survival demanded, each one convinced that there had to be another way. The Valanthi declared that they would rather die than lose their psychic gifts, that a life without their mental powers was not worth living. The Kreth retreated to their home systems and began building massive computational arrays, certain that their superior intellects could find a solution the precursors had missed. The Oravon simply denied that the threat was real, claiming that the Guardian was a trick, that humanity had somehow created this hoax to elevate their own status. And through it all, the countdown continued. Alara returned to Earth briefly, to report what she had learned and to help prepare her people for what was coming, and she found a world that did not know whether to celebrate or despair. "We are immune to these creatures," the Earth Council said. "Perhaps we should simply hide and let the other species face the consequences of their arrogance." "That is not who we are," Alara replied, standing before the most powerful humans alive. "We did not survive ice ages and wars and plagues by abandoning others. We survived by working together, by helping each other, by refusing to give up even when everything seemed lost." Some agreed with her, and some did not. But in the end, the Council decided to offer aid to any species that would accept it, not because they expected gratitude, but because it was the right thing to do. Ships were built, volunteers were gathered, and humanity prepared to face an enemy that had destroyed civilizations beyond counting. The first attacks came 4 months after Alara had touched the monolith. A Valanthi colony on the outer edge of the galaxy simply vanished overnight, 3 billion minds silenced in an instant, and those who went to investigate found nothing but empty cities and a strange darkness that lingered in the air. Then another colony fell, and another, and suddenly the threat that so many had dismissed as impossible became horrifyingly real. The Valanthi fleet mobilized, their most powerful warships racing to intercept the silence before it could reach their homeworld, and Alara watched the battle from a human observation station, hopping against hope that the alien weapons would work. They did not. The Valanthi ships opened fire with everything they had, weapons that could crack planets and tear holes in space itself. But the beams passed through the silence like light through water, doing nothing, affecting nothing. And then the creatures attacked. They did not use weapons in any traditional sense. Instead, they simply reached out with their formless bodies and touched the minds of the Valanthi crews, and everywhere they touched, life ended. Thousands of ships fell silent in seconds, their crews dead or worse than dead, their psychic screams echoing across space before being cut off forever. The galaxy watched in horror as its mightiest fleet was destroyed, without landing a single effective blow. Panic spread like wildfire, and suddenly the species that had mocked humanity were begging for help, desperate for anyone who could stand against the nightmare that was consuming them. Human ships were different. They were smaller and slower than the alien vessels, built with simple technology that the conquered had always considered primitive, but they had one crucial advantage. The silence could not sense them. Human crews could fly close to the creatures without being detected, could observe their movements and report back without drawing attention, and when they opened fire with their crude kinetic weapons and chemical explosives, they actually did damage. It was not much damage, barely enough to slow the silence down, but it was the first time anyone had hurt them at all. Word spread quickly, and suddenly humans were the most valuable resource in the galaxy. Alara found herself promoted to admiral of a joint fleet, commanding ships from a dozen different species, all of them looking to humanity for guidance on how to fight an enemy that had seemed invincible. She was not a soldier. She had never wanted to be a warrior, but she understood something that the other species did not. The precursors had been powerful beyond measure, masters of technology and psychic abilities that made the current civilizations look like children, and they had lost to the silence anyway. They had lost because they could not imagine fighting without their gifts, because they had forgotten how to struggle and improvise and survive with nothing but their wits and their will. Humanity had never had gifts to rely on, and so they had learned to make do with what they had. Under Alara's command, human engineers worked with Kreth scientists to develop new weapons, combining human creativity with alien knowledge to create things neither could have built alone. Human soldiers trained Valanthi warriors in the art of fighting without psychic powers, teaching them to rely on their physical senses and their instincts instead of their mental abilities. Human diplomats brought together species that had been rivals for millennia, convincing them that their old conflicts meant nothing in the face of extinction. And slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. The silence was still advancing, still consuming world after world, but now they were meeting resistance, now they were taking losses, now they were facing something they had never encountered before. A galaxy that refused to die quietly. But it was not enough, and Alara knew it was not enough, because for every small victory they won, the silence claimed a dozen more, and their forces were growing while the galaxy's defenders were shrinking. 6 months after the first attack, the silence reached the edge of Valanthi space, and the homeworld itself lay in their path. The High Seer contacted Alara, his face haggard and his pride broken. "We cannot stop them," he said. "We have tried everything, sacrificed millions, and still they come." "You know what must be done," Alara replied. "We cannot," the High Seer whispered. "Our gifts are everything to us. They are what makes us who we are. To lose them would be worse than death." "Death is what awaits you if you do nothing," Alara said. "But survival offers the chance to become something new, something that does not need gifts to be worthy." The High Seer closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there were tears streaming down his pale face. "Will you help us?" he asked. "We will help everyone," Alara promised. "That is what humans do." The final battle for Ethon Prime, began on a morning that should have been peaceful. With the pale blue sun rising over the temple where everything had started. Alara stood before the monolith one last time, surrounded by representatives from every species that still survived, and the Guardian watched them all with its shifting eyes. "The device is ready," the Guardian said, "but I must warn you again of what it will do. There is no revering this choice, no restoring what will be lost." "We understand," the Valanthi High Seer said, stepping forward to stand beside Alara. "We have debated and fought and denied this truth for too long, and billions have died because of our pride." The Kreth ambassador clicked in agreement. "Our calculations show that continued resistance without the device will result in total extinction within 18 standard months. The mathematics leave no room for hope." Even the Oravan Elder, ancient beyond measure and proud beyond reason, bowed his great head in acceptance. "We have lived for millions of years believing that our gifts made us superior. Perhaps it is time to discover who we are without them." Outside the temple, the sky was darkening as the silence approached, their formless bodies blotting out the stars, their hunger reaching toward the minds that had been calling to them for so long. Human ships formed the first line of defense, their crews calm and determined, ready to buy time for what needed to be done. Alara looked at the Guardian. "How do we activate the device?" "It requires two things," the Guardian replied. "A mind that cannot hear the song to serve as the template for silence, and a mind that can hear it to serve as the bridge between what was and what will be." "You mean a human and one of them," Alara said, gesturing to the aliens around her. "Yes," the Guardian confirmed. "The human will touch the monolith and provide the pattern of silence, while the other will channel that pattern to every mind in the galaxy. It will be painful for them, perhaps the most painful thing they have ever experienced." The High Seer stepped forward before anyone else could volunteer. "I will do it," he said. "I was the one who tried to have you arrested, who called you unworthy, who refused to believe that the universe could be so unfair as to make my people the victims of our own gifts. Let me be the one to set things right." Alara looked at him, this alien who had hated her from the moment they met, and she saw something in his eyes that had not been there before. "Respect." "Together then," she said, holding out her hand. The High Seer hesitated for just a moment, and then he took it, his long fingers wrapping around hers. They walked to the monolith together, human and Valanthi, and the Guardian stepped aside to let them pass. Outside, the silence had reached the planet's atmosphere, and the human fleet was engaging them with everything they had, explosions lighting up the sky like a second sun. Screams echoed through the psychic frequencies as the creatures began to feed, as minds across the planet were touched by the hungry darkness. "Now," Alara said, and she placed her free hand on the monolith. Light erupted from the artifact, brighter than before, and the High Seer gasped as the pattern of silence flowed through Alara and into him. It was like nothing he had ever felt, an absence where there had always been presence, a quiet where there had always been noise, and for a terrible moment he thought he was dying. But then he understood. This was not death, this was freedom. This was what it felt like to exist without chains he had never known he was wearing. He opened his mind and sent the silence outward, using the last of his psychic power to broadcast it to every corner of the galaxy. The effect was instantaneous. On 1,000 worlds, beings of every species felt their gifts fade like morning mist, felt the song of the precursors fall silent for the first time in their lives, felt themselves become something new and strange and terrifying. And on Ethon Prime, the silence stopped. The creatures that had been descending on the planet froze in midair, their formless bodies twisting in confusion, reaching out for minds that were no longer there. They could not sense the life below them anymore. The human fleet continued to fire, their weapons tearing into the suddenly vulnerable creatures, and one by one the silence began to retreat, fleeing back toward the void between galaxies, seeking prey they could actually find. It took 3 days for the last of them to leave, 3 days during which the galaxy held its breath and wondered if it was truly over. When the final creature vanished from sensor range, Ilara collapsed beside the monolith, exhausted beyond words. The High Seer lay next to her, his black eyes staring at the ceiling, and when he spoke his voice was hoarse. "I cannot hear them anymore," he said. "My people, my family, the voices that have been with me since birth, they are all silent now." "I know," Ilara said. "I am sorry." "Do not be," the High Seer replied, and to her surprise there was something like peace in his voice. "For the first time in my life, my thoughts are my own, and that is worth more than any gift." The galaxy that emerged from the silence was different from the one that had existed before. The Valanthi learned to communicate with words and gestures instead of thoughts, and they discovered that speaking allowed created connections that telepathy never had. The Kreth found that their slower minds could still solve problems, just with more patience and collaboration, and they learned to value the journey of discovery as much as the destination. The Oravan realized that wisdom did not require ancient memories, that every moment offered opportunities to learn and grow. And humanity, the species that had been considered inferior for so long, found itself at the center of a new galactic order. Not as rulers or conquerors, but as teachers and friends. Ilara returned to Earth a hero, but she refused the titles and honors that were offered to her. "I did not save the galaxy," she told the crowds that gathered to welcome her home. "We all saved it together, human and alien, working as equals for the first time in history." She looked up at the stars, which seemed brighter now than they ever had before. "They called us unworthy because we had no gifts," she said. "But being ungifted meant we had to earn everything we achieved. We had to struggle and fail and try again, and that made us stronger than any power the precursors could have given us." The High Seer, who had traveled to Earth to stand beside her, nodded in agreement. "You were not unworthy," he said. "You were simply ahead of us, and now we are ready to catch up." Ilara smiled and took his hand, and together they faced a future where the galaxy would finally learn what it meant to be truly equal. Not because they shared the same gifts, but because they shared the same silence.